Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to dive into the Civil War and Reconstruction era.
Yeah.
You guys gave us some really interesting articles from the Library of Congress, and we're hoping to sort of go beyond just like the basic textbooks, batters and dates, and sort of uncover some of those hidden stories and those interesting nuances that make this period in American history so compelling.
It's still relevant today.
Right. It's definitely not just a chapter in a history book.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, when they think about the Civil War, they know the basic differences between the North and the South.
Right.
But I was wondering if maybe you could paint a little bit of a more detailed picture for us.
The South was primarily agricultural.
Right.
And so they really relied on slave labor for their economy.
Right.
It was, fields and fields of cotton and tobacco.
Yeah.
So, they needed a lot of people to work those fields. The North, on the other hand, was becoming more industrialized.
Right.
So their economy didn't rely on slave labor. And in fact, a lot of people in the North thought that slavery was morally wrong and also inefficient.
Right.
It was holding the country back.
So these are really, big fundamental differences in values and in ways of life.
Absolutely.
And, these tensions that have been building for so long kind of reached this boiling point.
Yeah.
With the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860.
Right.
And, Lincoln is often, simplified in history as the great emancipator.
Right.
But his views on slavery were actually quite complex.
Huh.
So I know that he opposed the expansion of slavery. But I was wondering what his personal views on race and equality were like at the time.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, Lincoln did believe that slavery was morally wrong.
Right.
But, he still held some of the racial prejudices that were very common in his time. So he actually favored a very gradual approach to emancipation. And he even considered things like colonization.
Really?
Yeah. Sending freed slaves to other countries.
That's not something you typically learn in history class.
It's often left out.
Yeah, it kind of challenges that image we all have of him.
Definitely.
As that, great emancipator.
Yeah, and it shows how complex this man was and how complicated the politics of the time were.
Right.
I mean, he was leading a country that was literally tearing itself apart, on the verge of civil war.
Yeah, and the sources actually mentioned that his inauguration had extraordinary security measures.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there were fears of assassination attempts.
They were really afraid that somebody was going to try to kill him.
And then just a few years later comes the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863.
Right.
And that's often seen as that major turning point in the war. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely a watershed moment.
Yeah.
But it didn't actually free all the slaves. It only freed slaves that were in Confederate states that were still in rebellion.
So it was as much strategic as it was moral.
Exactly. It reframed the war from being just about preserving the Union to actually being about ending slavery.
Right.
And that helped a lot. Yeah. It got more support for the Union in the North and from other countries.
It's hard to imagine, the fear and the hope that people must felt hearing that news.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially in the South.
Yeah.
Now, Lincoln's words have really resonated throughout history.
Definitely.
And the Gettysburg Address is considered to be one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered.
One of the best.
So why is that? What makes it so enduring?
Well, he gave it right after the Battle of Gettysburg,
right,
which was this horrific battle with so many casualties.
Yeah.
And he basically said that the war wasn't just about territory or politics. It was about something bigger.
Yeah.
It was about equality and preserving a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
It's amazing that those words still inspire us.
Yeah.
Even today.
Definitely.
Sadly, Lincoln wouldn't live to see his vision for a reunited nation. He was assassinated just days after the war ended.
Yeah, it was a huge loss for the country.
And the Civil War still remains the deadliest conflict in American history.
By far.
Almost 620,000 soldiers died.
Right.
And countless more were wounded.
That's more than all other American wars combined.
Right up to that point.
Yeah.
But behind those numbers are so many individual stories of courage and sacrifice.
It's important to remember that, like, in the sources you share, there's a diary entry from a Confederate soldier named Gus Bowles.
Right.
And he writes about the horrors of war,
but
also about the camaraderie between the soldiers and how they were always afraid of dying.
And it wasn't just the soldiers who were affected by the war.
Of course not.
Right.
Women stepped up.
Yeah.
They worked in factories, they ran farms, they served as nurses.
Right.
Families were torn apart, communities were devastated. The whole country was changed by this war.
And then within that story, there's also the often overlooked stories of African-American soldiers who fought for the Union.
These men were incredibly brave.
Yeah.
They were fighting for a country that didn't even recognize them as citizens.
It's hard to even wrap your head around. They faced so much discrimination, prejudice,
constant threat,
and even harsher treatment if they were captured.
If they were captured by the Confederates, they were in big trouble.
Yeah. So what do you think motivated them to enlist?
I think a lot of them wanted to fight for their own freedom and for the freedom of their families.
Yeah.
Frederick Douglass said it best. He said that once, let the black man get upon his person, the brass letters, U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder. There is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship in the United States.
So powerful words.
Definitely.
Did their service change people's perceptions of African Americans at the time?
I think it definitely helped to shift public opinion towards abolition and towards recognizing black citizenship. But the fight for equality was far from over.
Of course.
It would continue for generations.
So we often focus on the big battles and the political fires of the Civil War.
Yeah.
But it's also important to remember the impact of the war on the everyday lives of people on both sides of the conflict.
Yeah. The North. They didn't see as much fighting, but they still felt the effects. Their industries boomed to meet the demands of the war. But that also led to some problems like inflation and economic inequality. Plus, there were those Confederate raids into the North, like Morgan's raid through Indiana. They were trying to disrupt supplies and scare people. It showed that the war wasn't so far away after all.
The South, on the other hand, faced a whole different set of problems.
Yeah, they had most of the fighting on their land. They saw towns and cities destroyed, crops burned. The Union blockade crippled their economy. No supplies were getting in or out. It was chaos.
Yeah. The sources mentioned a Georgia plantation that was plundered by Sherman's army. And also the impact on Texas cattle herds. Who were basically stranded. They couldn't sell their cattle because of the blockade.
Exactly.
So these are all just little glimpses into the suffering that people experienced.
Yeah. It's hard to even imagine.
Yeah. It's really a stark reminder that war doesn't just affect soldiers. It affects entire societies.
Absolutely.
And leaves these scars that can last for generations.
Definitely.
So the smoke cleared from the battlefields and a new chapter began. Reconstruction. This was a period of rebuilding, redefining, and reckoning with the deep wounds of the war.
It was a time of great hope, but also great challenges.
So what were some of the key issues and challenges that emerged?
Well, for one thing, there were a lot of different ideas about what Reconstruction should actually look like. A lot of white Southerners wanted to go back to the way things were before the war, with white supremacy and limited rights for African Americans. But a lot of Northerners and black Southerners wanted something totally different. They wanted full civil rights for freedmen, including the right to vote.
Yeah, that must have created a lot of tension.
It definitely did. It was a very difficult and divisive time.
What role did the federal government play?
Well, they were trying to hold everything together. They created the Freedmen's Bureau to help former slaves with things like food, clothing, and education. And they also passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to African American men.
Those were really landmark achievements.
Yeah, they were huge steps forward in the fight for equality.
But they also faced a lot of opposition.
Oh, yeah, tons of opposition. Especially in the South. There were groups like the Ku Klux Klan who used violence and intimidation to try and stop African Americans from exercising their rights.
So even though there were laws in place, the reality on the ground was very different.
Absolutely.
It sounds like Reconstruction was a period of both progress and setbacks.
It was definitely both. It was a very complicated time, full of contradictions and challenges.
That's so interesting. And it really, I think, it helps us understand the legacy of this era.
For sure.
And its continuing impact on American society today.
Definitely a lot to think about.
Yeah. But that's a discussion for our next segment.
Right.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Before the break, we were just talking about the challenges and complexities of Reconstruction, a period of rebuilding and redefining and really trying to heal from the wounds of the Civil War. One of the things I'm really interested in learning more about is the experience of the freedmen during this period of transition. What was life like for them after emancipation?
It's really important to keep in mind that emancipation, while a huge step towards freedom, didn't magically solve everything. They were free, but they still faced a lot of obstacles as they tried to build new lives for themselves.
Right. What were some of those obstacles?
I mean, the most pressing one was probably economic survival. Most of them didn't own any land, didn't have any money. Their education and skills were limited because, they had been enslaved. So they often had to rely on sharecropping, which meant working on land owned by white people and getting a share of the crops.
That sounds like it could easily lead to just another form of dependence, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, that was often the case. It kind of trapped them in a system that was kind of similar to slavery. White landowners still held a lot of power and control.
Right. But it wasn't just economic hardship they had to face, right?
No, definitely not. There was also widespread discrimination and violence. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized Black communities. They used intimidation, arson, even murder to keep Black people from exercising their newly won freedoms.
It's hard to imagine the kind of fear they must have lived with. But despite all this, there were also stories of resilience. The sources mention things like the Freedmen's Union Industrial School. Can you tell us about those initiatives?
Oh yeah, those were vital. Often supported by Northern philanthropists or religious groups, these organizations provided education, job training, and other support for freedmen. It was a way of showing that they believed in the potential of Black people and wanted to help them thrive.
That's really inspiring. One of the quotes that stood out to me was from a freedman named Houston Hartsfield Holloway. He said, "We colored people did not know how to be free, and the white people did not know how to have a free colored person about them."
Yeah, that really captures the essence of the challenges during that time, right? It was uncharted territory for everyone. Both Black and white people had to figure out how to navigate this new social order where old beliefs and power structures were being challenged.
So how did the federal government try to shape this process?
Well, they took some pretty groundbreaking actions. You have the 13th Amendment, which officially ended slavery. That was a monumental step.
Yeah, definitely a huge turning point.
Right. And then to further solidify those rights, you have the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all people born in the U.S., including formerly enslaved people, and guaranteed equal protection under the law.
Seems like a clear path toward equality, right?
Well, not so fast. The implementation of these amendments faced some serious obstacles. Many Southern states were really resistant to change. They enacted black codes and other laws that were discriminatory and tried to undermine the spirit of those amendments.
So a constant back and forth between progress and resistance.
Exactly. It was a battle between those who envisioned a more inclusive society and those who wanted to hold on to the old ways.
You mentioned the Freedmen's Bureau earlier. What was their role in all of this?
They were a lifeline for many freedmen, providing things like food, clothing, medical care, and really importantly, education. They helped set up schools and training programs, giving freedmen the tools they needed to become self-sufficient.
Seems like a much-needed resource during that chaotic period.
Oh, absolutely. But they also faced challenges. They were understaffed, underfunded, and faced a lot of hostility from white Southerners who saw them as meddling in their affairs.
But despite those challenges, what would you say was the ultimate impact of the Freedmen's Bureau? Did they succeed?
Well, maybe they didn't solve all the problems of Reconstruction, but their impact was definitely significant. They really helped lay the foundation for a more just and equitable society. It was a testament to the idea that education and economic empowerment are essential for real equality.
So, even with those efforts, we know that Reconstruction ultimately ended. What happened? Why did it decline? And what were the consequences?
It's a complicated story with several factors contributing to its demise. Northern support for the project started to wane. People were getting tired of the costs of military occupation in the South. Plus, there were political scandals that eroded public trust.
So it's kind of a combination of fatigue and shifting priorities up north.
Exactly. And then you have the rise of white supremacist violence in the South. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan really stepped up their attacks, terrorizing Black voters, trying to undermine the Republican governments that had been set up in those states.
So Reconstruction was abandoned before it could really achieve its goals.
Sadly, yes. In 1877, federal troops were pulled out of the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. And almost immediately, Southern states went back to white democratic rule, enacting Jim Crow laws that enforced segregation and denied Black people their rights.
It's really tragic to see the progress that was made being undone like that.
Yeah, it was a huge setback in the fight for racial equality in America. And the legacy of slavery and these unresolved issues from Reconstruction, they continued to haunt American society for many, many years to come. But even in the face of all this, there were people and communities who kept fighting for their rights, resisting injustice.
A real testament to the human spirit. It shows that the fight for equality never really ends. It just keeps evolving.
Exactly.
We've covered so much in this deep dive. We've gone from the battlefields to the halls of Congress. We've seen the triumphs and the tragedies. We've seen how the issues of race, equality, freedom that were at the heart of this era are still being grappled with today.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg, really. There's so much more to learn and explore.
Well, before we wrap up, in the next segment, we'll talk about some of the resources that are available for people who want to learn more, and we'll discuss how the themes of this period connect with the challenges we face today. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction, really trying to understand this pivotal period in American history. But, like with all of our deep dives, the exploration shouldn't stop here, right?
Definitely not. It's just the beginning, really. There are so many resources out there that can help you learn even more.
So, for those of us who are ready to keep learning, where should we start? What resources would you recommend?
Well, the articles you sent from the Library of Congress, those are a fantastic starting point.
Yeah, those were great.
The Library of Congress website, it's an amazing resource.
Yeah.
I mean, they have tons of primary sources, photographs, maps, all sorts of stuff that can really bring this period to life.
It's incredible that we have access to all that. Those firsthand accounts, documents from such a crucial time in history.
It really is. You can find letters written by soldiers during the war, diaries from plantation owners, freedmen, political cartoons, even sheet music from that era.
Wow, so it's really like a window into the past.
Exactly.
Are there any specific collections or resources on the Library of Congress website that you think people should check out?
Yeah, definitely. Their Civil War and Reconstruction collection, that's a great place to start.
Okay.
And they have a bunch of historic newspapers from that time that have been digitized, so you can read those online.
Oh, wow.
It's really interesting to see how people back then reacted to events, what they were debating, even what they were advertising. Gives you a real sense of their lives.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Are there any other places we can go, besides the Library of Congress, to learn more about this period?
Oh, for sure. Lots of museums and historical societies around the country have collections dedicated to the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Okay.
And many universities, they have archives and special collections that are open to the public.
And of course, there are tons of books on the subject. Everything from scholarly works to historical fiction.
Yeah, there's definitely no shortage of books out there.
And documentaries and films.
Oh, yeah. How could we forget those? Ken Burns' documentary, The Civil War, that's a classic for a reason.
Yeah, it is.
It's really powerful.
I feel like it can get kind of overwhelming, with so much information out there. Any tips for navigating all those resources?
Yeah, I think it helps to start with something specific that you're interested in. Maybe it's a particular battle, historical figure, or maybe a theme like the role of women or African Americans during the war.
Right. Focus on one thing to make it more manageable.
Exactly. And, learning about history, it's a journey, not a race.
That's a good way to put it.
There's always something new to discover.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, are there any final thoughts or key takeaways that you hope people will remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the Civil War and Reconstruction, they weren't just events that happened in the past, They were these pivotal moments that still affect us today.
Yeah, I think we've seen that throughout our conversation. The issues of race, equality, the meaning of freedom, all these things were at the heart of this era, and we're still wrestling with them today.
Exactly. And I think the more we understand about this period, the better equipped we are to face those challenges, to build a more just and equitable society.
That's a really great point. It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and names and battles. It's about understanding ourselves and the world we live in.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the Civil War and Reconstruction era. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive and that it inspires you to keep learning and exploring.